Dawn of War 4 just had a huge amount of new information revealed about its multiplayer game mode during the latest developers Ask Me Anything session, and whilst some of these answers confirm things we already suspected, others give us a much clearer idea of how the game is actually going to work once players start competing against each other. Now, this was focused almost entirely on multiplayer, with creative director Jan Thijssen and senior game designer Elliot Verbeest answering questions from the official Dawn of War 4 Discord community. They covered topics like faction balance, anti-deathball mechanics, cover, retreating, reinforcement, commanders, base building, hotkeys, interface customization, and even briefly the army painter, so there is quite a lot to go through. So the first major confirmation concerns the default win conditions in Quick Match, because Dawn of War 4 will use Annihilation as its standard multiplayer mode. Now, in Annihilation, the goal is to essentially destroy every enemy headquarters whilst protecting your own, which places much more emphasis on bases, production, and committing to the final assault than compared to a traditional victory point system. Now, that doesn't actually mean that every multiplayer match will use Annihilation, because players will also be able to select which modes they want to search for when entering matchmaking. Alongside the Annihilation game mode, there will also be Domination and Maelstrom, giving players three very different ways to approach competitive multiplayer. Domination is the victory point mode, where players capture and hold strategic positions across the map to gradually earn points. Now, this should naturally create fighting around fixed areas and force players to spread their armies rather than simply sitting inside their base or moving around as one enormous group. Maelstrom, though, sounds a lot less predictable, because objectives will dynamically appear around the map during the match. Players will need to react to changing locations, redirect their armies, and decide how much they are willing to commit to each new objective, which could create a much more mobile and chaotic style of play when compared to the Domination game mode. What's really interesting, though, is that players will have the ability to select one mode or search across all three, which is great, of course, if players strongly prefer one particular victory mode. It's also cool, though, because whilst you might not have a strong preference, you can also, of course, search for all three game modes if you don't really mind which game mode you want to play, but just want to play a game as soon as possible. Now, balance, of course, is a hot topic when it comes to multiplayer game modes, and the developers were asked how they intend to balance the game across 1 versus 1 and team matches, especially when every faction is designed to play very differently. Elliot explained that one of the core goals is to make each faction feel authentic to how it is portrayed in the Warhammer 40k universe, while still making sure multiplayer remains fair. That sounds pretty straightforward, but it becomes much more difficult when the factions are deliberately asymmetric. The developers did actually acknowledge, though, that faction asymmetry is especially difficult to balance outside of 1 versus 1 matches, because combinations of factions and abilities can create situations that are almost impossible to reproduce consistently during internal testing. A strategy that appears reasonable in a duel 1 versus 1 might become oppressive when 2 or 3 players combine specific armies, upgrades, or even stratagems in a team game. Elliot also made the point that kind of no amount of internal testing can match what thousands of players will discover after launch. He mentioned that once the community starts experimenting with every possible combination, players will inevitably find tactics, counters, and potentially broken interactions that the developers wouldn't have encountered before. The plan after launch, though, is with that data, they can identify the most damaging problems and clearly explain the purposes behind balance changes. It certainly sounds pretty tricky, but I guess we'll just have to see how it all pans out. Now, another major question concerned deathball armies, where players could place almost everything they own in terms of units into one massive formation and move it around the map with very little tactical thought. It could actually become a serious problem in large-scale strategy games, because individual unit positioning and combined arms tactics kind of stops mattering once the strongest option is simply grouping everything together. Dawn of War 4, though, is using several mechanics to discourage that style of play, beginning with weapons and war gear designed to punish tightly packed armies. Elliot actually specifically mentioned the Slugger Boy's Burner and the Necron's Monolith Particle Whip as examples of tools that become particularly effective against concentrated groups. So I guess this means that scouting and reacting to the opponent's army composition should be extremely important, as it always is. In fact, it even sounds like war gear choices that could look unnecessary during the early game could in fact become the answer to a player who is massing up infantry, while failing to prepare the correct upgrades could allow that same army to overwhelm you. In any case, every faction will also have access to a powerful stratagem that is not tied to the commander chosen before the match. It's said that these faction stratagems can devastate large concentrations of units when placed correctly, creating another reason not to pile an entire army into one small area without considering what the opponent still has available. And actually, as it happens, I think we got to see one of those stratagems in action during one of the battle reports with the Admech decimating Necron units. Now, the AMA then moved into discussing cover, retreating, on-field reinforcement, and veterancy, where it was explained that units benefit from experience in different ways depending on the faction, with some receiving improved statistics and others unlocking entirely new abilities as they gain levels. As you can imagine then, it certainly sounds like preserving experienced squads could therefore become a major part of multiplayer, because losing a veteran unit doesn't only just mean losing the resources spent producing it, but you'll also be losing the time, combat experience, and additional capabilities that the unit gained throughout the match. Now, it turns out that cover is one of the primary tools actually for keeping the infantry alive against ranged attacks. It significantly reduces incoming damage when used correctly, and I know a lot of people have been talking about cover in Dawn of War 4 and actually commenting on, well, perhaps the lack of it from what we've seen so far. But the developers have said that maps will feature directional cover, as well as garrisonable structures that protect units from every direction. Now, it turns out the factions will also interact with cover in pretty different ways, rather than following one universal system. The Orcs, for example, can construct their own cover, while the Adeptus Mechanicus can build a garrisonable structure that gives them a protected position on the battlefield. Necrons, though, won't actually use cover at all, which immediately separates them from the other factions and kind of likely reflects their reliance on durability, regeneration, and other faction-specific defensive mechanics. Now, of course, cover will not be unbeatable, because flamers, grenades, and other war gear can negate its benefits. Melee combat will also force units out of cover, giving aggressive players a direct method of breaking defensive positions, rather than just standing at range and trading damage indefinitely. As it happens, Elliot described cover as more of an optimization than something that automatically determines the outcome of every engagement. It could turn an evenly matched battle in your favor, but it won't rescue an army that is badly outnumbered or completely countered by the opponent. Of course, this sounds pretty sensible. Players who take advantage of terrain will gain an edge, while the opponent still has several ways to respond through melee, abilities, or specialized weapons. Retreating is going to be another important method of preserving units though, especially when squads become trapped in melee or need to quickly return to a safer position. And it was clarified that when a retreat order is issued, the unit actually moves to the nearest production structure whilst taking reduced damage, but the player will temporarily lose control over it. There is also an interesting additional layer to the retreat mechanic though, where the retreat icon above the unit initially appears red. Eventually, it will turn yellow, and once that happens, the player can actually cancel the retreat order. This is going to prevent retreating becoming something that players can instantly reverse the moment that the danger has passed, because there will still be a period where the unit is fully committed to leaving the fight. At the same time though, allowing the order to be cancelled later prevents the mechanic from becoming too punishing on larger maps, where a unit might otherwise run all the way back to a distant base. It's looking like the timing of a retreat will certainly create a constant sort of risk and reward decision, where keeping a squad in combat for a few additional seconds might just allow it to finish an enemy unit or deal enough damage to win the engagement, but every extra moment also increases the chance of losing that squad entirely. The opponent will also need to make a decision when a unit begins retreating. They can commit additional damage, focus fire, and maybe even some of the stratagems in the attempt to secure the kill. But chasing a retreating unit could expose their own forces to distract them from the rest of the battle also. The next topic of discussion was the on-field reinforcement, and it might be one of the most important mechanics discussed in the AMA, because the developers actually described it as the most powerful of the 3 preservation tools. The system allows players to spend resources to replace models inside damaged squads, while those units still remain out on the battlefield and still remain a threat. Now, that actually creates several possible uses, because reinforcement can keep a squad fighting during an engagement, help defend an important position, or buy enough time for additional units to arrive. And so instead of immediately withdrawing every damaged squad, players can invest resources into maintaining their presence on the front line. Auto-reinforcing units will noticeably be more difficult to destroy, which means activating it at the correct time could decide a major battle. The downside though is that maintaining reinforcement across several units could drain an economy incredibly quickly. In fact, a player might win a fight by constantly replacing casualties, only to realize that they've spent all the resources they needed for maybe new units, and so that creates a direct link between battlefield decisions and economic management, because every model replaced during combat represents resources that could have been spent somewhere else, and in fact, they could have been spent on bigger, better, higher tech units. Now, commanders were also another major topic discussed, particularly how they will function outside of the campaign, because in multiplayer, commanders will be generic faction units rather than the named campaign characters. And in fact, players can select them before the match alongside their faction. They won't usually appear at the beginning of the matches though, because they must be produced from the headquarters for a resource cost after the necessary unlocks have been completed. And so it turns out this kind of places them closer to powerful mid-game units rather than sort of free heroes that immediately dominate the opening minutes. What's pretty cool as well though, that custom match settings will also give players more control over this, because commanders can be enabled as starting units or even just disabled entirely. That will allow players to create their own style of multiplayer, whether they want hero-led battles from the beginning or a more traditional match focused just on normal units and technology. Now, when it comes to interface and control options, Elliot actually mentioned quite a bit here in the official Discord, where he revealed that the user interface will be scalable, and so it sounds like players will be able to make the interface elements larger or smaller, depending on their screen, resolution, and I guess personal preference. It's of course not something that changes the game itself, but it actually creates a major difference in how comfortable the playing experience will feel over a long period of time. The hotkey system will also offer a good amount of customization, it turns out, rather than just forcing every player into one control layout. Elliot confirmed that the players will be able to rebind camera controls, unit abilities, and certain modifier keys, such as shift, alongside other commands. Players will also be able to choose between different presets, including the default layout with WASD camera movement, and a more traditional control scheme aimed at players who prefer classic RTS controls. That should make the game easier to approach for newer players who are used to moving the camera with WASD without alienating long-time strategy players who already have years of muscle memory built around a more conventional setup. Elliot did also confirm though that a grid-based RTS hotkey system will be available as the classic preset. Taken all together, the scalable UI, rebindable commands, and multiple presets suggest that developers are giving players a fair amount of control over how the game can be controlled. That is of course especially valuable for competitive multiplayer gamers, where awkward key placements or keybinds can make it more of an unfamiliar experience for them. Now when it comes to buildings, I won't go into too much detail with this because we've covered them in the individual faction guides, but something that was actually kind of new and I don't think we found out before was that the Space Marines, when they build their structures across the map, the further away from their headquarters that they place new buildings, the longer that they take to deploy. Of course, being able to drop buildings from orbit is a powerful tool, especially if you want to formulate a forward production position, but I guess in some ways it won't be as strong considering the buildings are taking longer to build as well. There is a major risk too, because enemy players could potentially take the building down before it even fully constructs. Now the final part of the AMA offered a small update on the Army Painter. Although the developers are still clearly keeping most of the details hidden, Elliot did say that more information will arrive in the near future, and that he is excited to show everything it can do at launch. It looks like we could be having a big reveal soon. And Jan did go even further, explaining that there's probably no other painter with more options. That is of course a very exciting thing, to be honest, especially for a Warhammer game where players will expect a large amount of control over colours, armor sections, symbols, and army identity. It sounds like the system will be very intricate and detailed, and the developers hint that it's going to be a major feature rather than just a small side piece. Overall, the AMA gives us a much clearer picture of Dawn of War 4's multiplayer game mode. It will support 3 different matchmaking modes, Annihilation as the default, while giving objective-focused players the choice of Domination and the more dynamic Maelstrom mode. The combat is being built around unit preservation, veterancy, cover, retreating, reinforcement, and specialized counters to massed armies. At the same time though, each faction approaches base building, movement, and defensive positioning in its own special way, which should give multiplayer matches a great deal of variety. The additional Discord answers also show that the developers are paying attention to the practical side of playing an RTS, which is of course a very welcome sight to see, with scalable interface elements, rebindable controls, and both modern as well as classic hotkey presets. And these features are exactly the kind of options that can determine whether the controls feel natural after a few matches, or just remain frustrating for the entire life of the game. The biggest question though, I guess, is when it comes to multiplayer, is whether all of these asymmetric systems can remain balanced once the wider player base starts experimenting with them. The developers do appear aware of that challenge, and they have already committed to using player feedback and match data after launch. But I guess the real test will come once competitive players begin pushing every mechanic to its limit. It's certainly an exciting time to be a Warhammer fan, but let me know in the comment section below what you think about multiplayer details revealed in this AMA, and which of the 3 game modes do you expect to play the most? Are you going straight into Annihilation, or does the constantly changing objective system in Maelstrom sound more interesting to you? Now, whilst we touched upon it briefly, I do have a deeper dive into the Army Painter reveals from a recent interview. If you'd like to watch that, click on the end card on your screen right now. But as always, take care and see you next time.